In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers touch the clouds and dreams collide with reality, Abigail Reynolds lived a life of quiet strength. She was a divorce lawyer, one of the best in Manhattan, known for her sharp mind and unshakable resolve. But beneath her polished exterior, she carried a secret heavier than the city itself. For 5 years, she had been married to Daniel Prescott, the powerful CEO of Prescott Enterprises, a man she had never met. A husband who existed only as a signature on a piece of paper, forced upon her by her grandfather's dying wish. She often wondered about him, this stranger she was tied to, but tonight, something felt different. The air buzzed with excitement as Abigail stepped into a glittering ballroom in Manhattan. It was a gala to welcome Daniel Prescott back from London, a night of champagne and celebration. The chandeliers sparkled above, casting light on faces she didn't care to know. She felt out of place, a shadow among the elite. In her mind, she whispered to herself, "I've lived 5 years with a husband who's nothing more than a name. I don't know what he looks like, what he sounds like, but tonight, I feel something stirring, like fate is watching me, waiting." She wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, her auburn hair falling in soft waves. She moved through the crowd, unnoticed, until a familiar voice stopped her. Eleanor Vaughn, her stepmother, pressed a glass of wine into her hand with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Drink, Abigail, loosen up a little," Eleanor said, her tone too sweet, too practiced. Abigail hesitated, but politeness won. She took a sip, then another, and soon the room began to blur. Her head spun, her thoughts slipped away, and the last thing she remembered was a pair of strong hands catching her as she fell. When she woke, the world was different. She lay in a bed that wasn't hers, the sheets cool against her skin. Beside her was a man, his face half hidden in the dim light. Her heart raced as she pieced it together, a night she couldn't fully recall, a moment that felt both wrong and inevitable. She slipped out of bed, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. She glanced back at him, his dark hair tousled, his breathing steady. "Who are you?" she thought, "and why does my heart ache to stay?" But she didn't wait for answers. She fled into the dawn, leaving behind the stranger who would change everything. That man was Daniel Prescott, her husband, the one person she was bound to, yet the one she couldn't face. As she stumbled into the cold morning air, her mind raced with questions. What had happened? Why couldn't she remember? And why did her chest tighten with something she couldn't name? She told herself it was a mistake, a fleeting lapse, but deep down she felt the pull of something more. "I ran from him, from my own life," she thought, her breath catching in her throat. "But why does my heart keep racing for him, even now?" Back at her apartment, Abigail stood before the mirror, staring at the woman she'd become. A wife in name only, a lawyer by trade, a soul adrift. She didn't know that the man she'd left behind was waking up too, his mind clouded with fragments of the night. Daniel Prescott, the untouchable CEO, rubbed his eyes and muttered, "Who was she?" He couldn't place her face, couldn't grasp the memory, but something lingered, a warmth he couldn't shake. He dismissed it as nothing, a distraction he didn't need. After all, he had a marriage to end, a past to erase. He had no idea that the woman he longed to forget was the one he'd soon turn to for help. Abigail sank into her chair, the weight of the night pressing down on her. She didn't know how to feel, shame, fear, or something softer, something dangerous. She closed her eyes and let the silence take her, but her thoughts wouldn't rest. "I've spent years building walls around my heart," she mused, "but in one night, they started to crack. What have I done? And what comes next?" Little did she know, fate wasn't finished with her yet. The man she'd run from was about to walk back into her life, and this time, there'd be no escaping him. Abigail Reynolds sat in her small, cluttered office in downtown Manhattan, the hume of the city seeping through the walls. Her desk was piled with case files, a testament to her skill as a divorce lawyer. But today, her mind was elsewhere. The night at the gala lingered like a ghost, the memory of a stranger's touch haunting her every quiet moment. She tried to focus, to push it aside, but her heart wouldn't let her. She stared at the phone on her desk, willing it to stay silent when it rang, sharp and insistent. She answered, and everything changed. On the other end was a voice she didn't recognize, crisp and commanding. "This is Daniel Prescott, CEO of Prescott Enterprises," it said. "I need the best divorce lawyer in New York. I've heard you're it, Clara Bennett." Abigail froze, her breath catching. Clara Bennett was her professional alias, a shield she wore in courtrooms and boardrooms. But Daniel Prescott, her husband, the man she'd woken beside just days ago, was calling her. He didn't know who she was, didn't suspect the woman he wanted to hire was the wife he despised. "I need this handled quickly," he continued. "Name your price." Abigail's mind raced, her fingers tightening around the receiver. $10 million, she said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. It was an outrageous sum, enough to save her struggling law firm from collapse, but it was also a test. Would he agree? There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "Done," he replied. "Meet me at my office tomorrow, 8 sharp." The line went dead, and Abigail sank back in her chair, her heart pounding. He doesn't know it's me, she thought. But why does this feel like a trap? I can't escape. The next morning, she stood before the towering glass facade of Prescott Enterprises, her reflection staring back at her. She wore a tailored gray suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun, every inch the professional, but inside she was unraveling. She stepped into the elevator, her thoughts a tangle of fear and resolve. "I've built my life on control," she told herself, "but now I'm walking into his world, a world that could destroy me." When the doors opened, she saw him, Daniel Prescott, standing by a window overlooking the city. He turned and her breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark eyes that pierced through her. He didn't recognize her, not from that night, not from the marriage papers he'd signed 5 years ago. He gestured to a chair. "Sit," he said, his tone clipped. "I want her gone. My wife. She's a mistake I need erased. No assets, no contact, nothing." Abigail sat, her hands clasped to hide their trembling. She nodded, forcing a smile. "I'll make it happen, Mr. Prescott," she said, but inside her heart twisted. He doesn't see me, she thought, but every word he says cuts deeper than he'll ever know. Daniel leaned forward, his gaze intense. "She's a shadow from my past," he said. "My grandfather forced this marriage, some debt of honor I never wanted. I want her out of my life." Abigail swallowed hard, her throat tight. She scribbled notes she didn't need, a shield against his words. "I understand," she replied, her voice calm. "I'll draft the papers." But in her mind, she screamed, "If you knew I was her, would you hate me more? Or would you see me, really see me for the first time?" The meeting ended and Abigail stood to leave, her legs unsteady. Daniel watched her go, a flicker of something in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps, or doubt. "She's good," he thought. "Efficient, sharp. But there's something about her I can't place." He shook it off, turning back to his work. For him, this was business, a clean break from a past he loathed. For her, it was survival, a chance to save her firm and bury her secret deeper. She stepped into the elevator, the doors closing like a curtain on her composure. "He wants me gone," she mused, "but he's asking me to do it. How do I live with that?" Back at her office, Abigail locked the door and let the facade fall. She pressed her hands to her face, her breath shaky. She'd agreed to tear apart her own marriage, to stand before the man she was tied to and pretend she was someone else. "It's just a job," she told herself. "But it's not. It's my life, my heart, my everything." She thought of that night, the blurred edges of memory, the warmth of his presence beside her. Had he felt it too? Or was she alone in this strange, aching pull? She opened her laptop, starting the paperwork he'd demanded. Each word she typed felt like a betrayal, of him, of herself. "I'm erasing us," she thought. "But maybe that's what we both need. Freedom from a bond neither of us chose." Yet as she worked, a quiet voice whispered in her soul, "What if he's more than a name? What if he's the man I've been waiting for?" She pushed it down, burying it beneath her resolve. She had to do this. For her firm, for her future. But deep down, she knew this was only the beginning. That night, Abigail stood at her window, the city lights stretching out before her. She traced the outline of Prescott Enterprises in the distance, a beacon of power and pain. He doesn't know who I am, she thought, but I know him, and that's my curse. She turned away, her heart heavy with secrets she couldn't share. Tomorrow she'd face him again, play the role of Clara Bennett, and hide the truth of Abigail Reynolds. But with every step, she felt the threads of fate tightening, pulling her closer to a man she couldn't let herself love. Abigail Reynolds walked the tightrope of her double life with a grace she didn't feel. By day, she was Clara Bennett, the poised and brilliant lawyer tasked with ending Daniel Prescott's marriage. By night, she was Abigail, the woman who carried the weight of that marriage in her heart, a secret she buried deeper with each passing hour. The walls of Prescott Enterprises had become her battlefield, a place where she faced the man she was bound to, the man who didn't know her, yet whose presence stirred something she couldn't name. And as the days turned to weeks, those walls began to crumble. It started with late nights. The divorce case was complex, tangled in years of unspoken resentment and legal intricacies. Abigail and Daniel found themselves alone in his office more often than not, the city skyline glowing beyond the glass. Papers littered his desk, coffee cups piled up, and the air grew heavy with something more than work. One evening, as the clock struck midnight, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on her. "You're tireless, Clara," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Most people would have given up by now." Abigail met his gaze, her heart fluttering. "I don't give up easily," she replied, but in her mind she added, "Not on my clients, and not on you." The next night he surprised her. "I'm starving," he said, standing abruptly. "Let's get dinner." "It's not a request." Abigail hesitated, her professional instincts warring with the pull she felt toward him. "It's just work," she told herself, but her heart whispered otherwise. They ended up at a quiet restaurant in Midtown, the kind with dim lights and soft music. Daniel ordered caviar without asking, setting the plate between them. "It's my favorite," he said, almost to himself. Abigail froze, her fork hovering midair. Caviar was her favorite too, a secret she'd never shared with him. "How does he know?" she thought. "Or is it just chance pulling us closer?" She watched him across the table, his sharp features softened by the candlelight. He talked about the case, about his frustration with the marriage he couldn't escape, but there was something else in his voice, a vulnerability he didn't hide. Abigail listened, her resolve weakening. "I want to hate him," she thought, "for wanting me gone, for not seeing me, but every word he speaks draws me in, and I can't stop it." When he smiled, a rare, genuine smile, her heart ached. She wanted to reach across the table to tell him everything, but she couldn't, not yet. Days later, another moment broke through her defenses. They were back in his office, sorting through files, when a scuffle broke out in the hallway. A disgruntled employee, fired earlier that week, had returned, shouting and shoving. In the chaos, Abigail's bracelet, a cherished gift from her late grandfather, slipped from her wrist and shattered on the floor. She gasped, dropping to her knees to gather the pieces. "It's all I have left of him," she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand brushing hers as he picked up a fragment. "Let me fix it," he said, his tone gentle. "I don't want anyone hurting you, not even me." Abigail looked up, their faces inches apart. His eyes held hers, and for a moment the world faded away. She felt the warmth of his breath, the steadiness of his presence, and something shifted inside her. "He doesn't know who I am," she thought, "but he's protecting me, and I don't know how to stop wanting him." He stood, offering her a hand, and she took it, her fingers lingering in his. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. He nodded, turning away, but not before she saw the flicker of something in his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or longing. Back at her apartment that night, Abigail held the broken bracelet, tracing its jagged edges. Daniel had taken it with a promise to repair it, and the gesture lingered in her mind. She closed her eyes, letting her thoughts spill free. "I've spent years guarding my heart," she mused, "building walls to keep everyone out. But he's slipping through the cracks, and I don't know how to stop it." She thought of his voice, his touch, the way he looked at her when he thought she was. Was it possible he felt something too, or was she imagining it? The next day he returned the bracelet, whole and gleaming. "I had it fixed," he said, slipping it onto her wrist. His fingers brushed her skin, and a shiver ran through her. "It looks good on you," he added, his voice low. Abigail smiled, her heart racing. "It means more than you know," she said, but in her mind she added, "because it's a piece of me you've touched, a piece you've healed." She wanted to tell him then, to confess everything, but fear held her back. "What if he hates me?" she thought, "when he learns the truth?" Their meetings grew warmer, their conversations deeper. He told her about his childhood, about the pressure of running Prescott Enterprises, about the grandfather who'd forced him into a marriage he didn't want. Abigail listened, her heart breaking for him. "He's not the cold man I thought he was," she realized. "He's trapped, just like me." And with every word, she fell a little more. She began to notice the small things. The way he rubbed his neck when he was tired. The way his eyes softened when he spoke to her. "I shouldn't feel this way," she told herself, "but I do, and it's tearing me apart." One evening, as they walked back from another late dinner, the city alive around them, Daniel stopped. "You're different, Clara," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I don't know how to explain it, but you make this easier." Abigail's breath caught, her pulse quickening. "I'm just doing my job," she said, but her heart screamed, "I'm falling for you and I can't stop." He stepped closer, his hand brushing her arm. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, and she wanted him to, more than anything. But he pulled back, his expression unreadable. "Good night," he said, and walked away, leaving her standing there, her heart in pieces. Alone in her apartment, Abigail sank onto the couch, her mind a whirlwind. "He's breaking down my walls," she thought, "and I'm letting him. But he doesn't know who I am, and when he does, this will all crumble." She pressed the bracelet to her chest, its cool metal grounding her. "I want to believe in us," she whispered to herself, "but how can I, when I'm the secret he'll hate?" She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheek. She was falling in love with Daniel Prescott, her husband, her client, the man who wanted her gone, and she didn't know how to stop. Abigail Reynolds stood at a crossroads she couldn't see, her heart caught in a storm of secrets and longing. The late nights with Daniel Prescott had woven a fragile thread between them, a connection she cherished yet feared. She played her role as Clara Bennett flawlessly, crafting the divorce papers he demanded, all while hiding the truth that she was the wife he wanted gone. But fate, relentless and cruel, had other plans. The walls she'd built were about to collapse, and the man she was falling for would soon face the woman he'd sworn to erase. It happened on a rainy afternoon in his office at Prescott Enterprises. The city outside was gray, the patter of rain against the windows a soft echo to the tension within. Daniel sat across from her, reviewing documents, when the door swung open. Ryan Sullivan strode in, a former rival from Daniel's college days, his smile sharp and knowing. Abigail's stomach dropped. She'd met Ryan before, a man with a grudge against Daniel, a man who thrived on chaos. "You've been busy, Prescott," Ryan said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Hiring the best lawyer in town to ditch your wife. But do you even know who she is?" Daniel frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about, Sullivan?" he asked, his tone edged with impatience. Ryan laughed, a cold, cutting sound, and turned to Abigail. "Tell him, Clara," he said, "or should I say Abigail Reynolds. Time's up." The room went still, the air thick with unspoken dread. Abigail's heart pounded, her hands clenching in her lap. Daniel's gaze shifted to her, confusion hardening into suspicion. "What's he saying?" he demanded, his voice low. Abigail took a breath, steadying herself. She met his eyes, her own glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't mean to deceive you," she said. "I'm Abigail Reynolds, your wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood, his chair scraping against the floor, his face a mask of shock and fury. "You're her?" he roared. "You've been lying to me this whole time?" His words hit her like blows, each one cracking the fragile hope she'd clung to. "I didn't lie," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I took the case because you asked me to. I wanted to give you what you wanted, freedom from me." Daniel paced, his hands raking through his hair. "Freedom?" he snapped. "You've been playing me, sitting here pretending while I—" He stopped, his breath ragged, unable to finish. Abigail stood, her knees weak but her resolve unbroken. "I never wanted this marriage either," she said. 5 years, Daniel, tied to a man who didn't know I existed, but then I met you, really met you, and everything changed." She paused, her voice softening. "I didn't expect to feel this way." Daniel stared at her, his anger warring with something deeper, something he couldn't name. Ryan smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Quite the twist, isn't it?" he said. "But there's more. Tell him the rest, Abigail." Her heart sank. She'd hoped to keep it hidden a little longer, but Ryan's presence left her no choice. She touched her stomach, a gesture so subtle Daniel almost missed it. "I'm pregnant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months. From that night at the gala. Daniel's eyes widened, his anger giving way to disbelief. "Pregnant?" he repeated, stepping closer. "You're carrying my child, and you didn't tell me?" Abigail looked away, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know how," she said. "You wanted me gone. How could I tell you this?" Daniel's hands clenched into fists, his emotions a tangle of rage and guilt. "Why didn't you say something?" he asked, his voice breaking. Abigail met his gaze, her own steady despite the pain. "Because I don't need you to love me, Daniel," she said, "but I won't let my child grow up in a world where you despise us." He flinched, her words cutting deeper than he'd expected. "I don't despise you," he said, almost to himself. "I don't know what I feel anymore." Ryan clapped slowly, breaking the moment. "Beautiful," he said. "But I'll leave you two to sort this out." He slipped out, leaving them alone in the wreckage of their truth. That night, Abigail sat in her apartment, the rain a steady drum against her window. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the life within her. "I'll protect you," she thought, "no matter what it costs me." But her mind drifted to Daniel, to the hurt in his eyes, the confusion. "He's not the man I thought he was," she mused. "He's lost, just like me, and I'm breaking us both." She wanted to hate him, to let go, but her heart wouldn't allow it. "I'm falling for him," she admitted, "and it's tearing me apart." The next day, her stepmother, Eleanor Vaughn, stormed into her office, her brother Jacob trailing behind. "We know about the baby," Eleanor said, her voice cold. "You can't keep it. The Prescott fortune is ours to claim, and that child complicates everything." Abigail stood, her anger flaring. "This is my child," she said, "not a bargaining chip. You've taken enough from me, my father's legacy, my peace." "Ye won't take this too," Jacob sneered. "You're a fool," he said. "They'll destroy you for this." Abigail squared her shoulders. "Let them try," she said. "I'll fight for what's mine." Daniel, meanwhile, wrestled with his own turmoil. He sat in his office, the divorce papers untouched before him. "She's my wife," he thought, "and she's carrying my child. How did I not see her?" He remembered her strength, her quiet grace, the way she'd stood up to him even as he raged. I'd been blind, he realized, pushing her away when she was right here all along. He wanted to go to her, to fix this, but doubt held him back. What if she hates me now, he wondered. What if I've lost her for good? Their paths crossed again at a meeting, the tension between them palpable. Daniel's voice was softer this time. "Why didn't you trust me?" he asked. Abigail looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Because I didn't trust myself," she said. "I didn't want to need you, Daniel, but I do." He stepped closer, his hand hovering near hers. "I don't know how to fix this," he said, "but I want to try." Abigail's heart ached, torn between hope and fear. "Don't make promises you can't keep," she said, turning away. But in her mind she cried, "I want to believe you, more than anything." The pressure mounted as Eleanor and Jacob schemed, their demands growing darker. They cornered Abigail in her office, Eleanor's voice venomous. "End it," she said, "or we'll make sure you lose everything." Abigail stood tall, her hand on her stomach. "I'll lose it all before I let you touch my child," she said. "You don't own me anymore." They left, their threats hanging in the air. But Abigail felt a strange peace. "I'm not alone," she thought, feeling the baby's presence. "And maybe, just maybe, he's with me too." Daniel found her that evening, his face etched with worry. "I heard about your family," he said. "Are you okay?" Abigail nodded, her eyes meeting his. "I have to be," she said, "for us." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "I'm here," he said, "if you'll let me." She smiled, a tear slipping free. "I don't know what this means," she said, "but I'm tired of running." In her heart she added, "I've fought so long to stand alone, but with you, I don't want to anymore." Their moment was fleeting, a fragile bridge between them, but the world outside pressed in. Eleanor's threats, Ryan's schemes, the weight of their tangled past. Abigail knew the truth had changed everything, and there was no going back. "I love him," she thought, staring at the city lights. "And that's my strength, my sacrifice." She didn't know what tomorrow held, but for the first time she faced it with hope, her hand in his, her child within her, a family she'd never dared to dream of. Abigail Reynolds stood on the edge of a life she'd never imagined, her heart a battlefield of love and loss. The truth had bound her to Daniel Prescott in ways neither had foreseen, a fragile thread stretched taut by secrets and sacrifice. She carried his child, a quiet promise nestled within her, and though their bond had deepened, the world around them conspired to tear it apart. Ryan Sullivan, with his venomous ambition, watched from the shadows, ready to strike, and Abigail, caught between her past and her future, faced a choice that would define them both. It began with a phone call late at night. Abigail was in her apartment, the city's glow filtering through her window, when her phone buzzed. An unfamiliar voice rasped through the line. "We have a message from Ryan Sullivan," it said. $100 million, or you and your baby are finished. Meet us in an hour, alone." The call ended, leaving her breathless. She pressed a hand to her stomach, fear clawing at her resolve. "I won't let them take you," she thought, her voice steady in her mind. "But how do I fight this alone?" She didn't tell Daniel, couldn't bear to pull him into the darkness she'd brought upon herself. She slipped out into the night, the streets of Manhattan cold and unforgiving. She reached an abandoned warehouse on the edge of the city, the meeting place Ryan had chosen. He stood there, his smile ablaze in the dim light, flanked by two men she didn't recognize. "You're braver than I thought," he said, stepping closer. "Where's the money?" Abigail lifted her chin, her eyes fierce. "I don't have it," she said, "but you won't touch my child." Ryan laughed, a sound that chilled her. "We'll see," he said, nodding to his men. Before she could react, they grabbed her, their hands rough against her arms. She struggled, her voice rising. "Let me go," she cried, but Ryan only watched, his amusement growing. "You should have stayed out of this," he said. "Daniel's weakness is you, and I'll use it to break him." Abigail's heart raced, her thoughts a frantic prayer. "I can't give up," she told herself. "Not for me, not for my baby." She twisted free for a moment, her breath ragged, when the warehouse door crashed open. Daniel stood there, his face a storm of fury and fear. "Let her go," he roared, his voice echoing through the space. Ryan turned, his smirk fading. "You're early, Prescott," he said. But Daniel didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, tackling one of the men holding Abigail. The other swung at him, a fist connecting with his side, but Daniel fought back, his strength fueled by something primal. Abigail broke free, stumbling toward him. "Daniel!" she cried, reaching out, but a sharp pain erupted as Ryan struck him from behind. Daniel fell, blood seeping from a gash on his back, and Abigail screamed his name. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she pressed against the wound. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't leave me, not now." His eyes fluttered open, finding hers. "Don't go, Abigail," he whispered, his hand grasping hers. "Not this time," she sobbed, her tears falling onto his face. "I'm here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Ryan advanced, his rage palpable, but sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the night. He cursed, fleeing with his men as police lights flashed closer. Abigail clung to Daniel, her world narrowing to the man bleeding in her arms. "You came for me," she thought, her heart aching with love and guilt. "Why did you risk everything?" Paramedics arrived, pulling her away as they worked on him, and she watched, helpless, as they loaded him into an ambulance. "I can't lose him," she prayed. "Not when I've just found him." Days later, Daniel woke in a hospital room, the sterile white walls a stark contrast to the chaos he'd left behind. Abigail sat beside him, her eyes red from sleepless nights. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft with relief. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but certain. "I had to save you," he said. "I couldn't let him take you from me." She smiled, tears welling again. "You didn't have to," she said, "but you did, and I'll never forget it." He looked at her, his gaze steady. "I didn't know I loved you," he said, "until I almost lost you." Abigail's heart swelled, but the weight of their reality pressed down. She'd spent those days thinking, planning, knowing what she had to do. She pulled a folder from her bag, the divorce papers she'd prepared as Clara Bennett. "It's over, Daniel," she said, sliding them toward him. "I'm setting us free." His face fell, confusion clouding his eyes. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Abigail took a breath, her resolve firm. "I forgive you," she said, "for everything. But I need to live for myself, for our child." Daniel stared at the papers, his hand trembling as he touched them. "You don't have to do this," he said. "We can figure it out together." Abigail shook her head, her smile bittersweet. "You deserve a life you choose," she said, "not one forced on you. And I deserve that too." She stood, her hand resting on her stomach. "I'll always carry a piece of you," she said, "but I can't stay." He reached for her, but she stepped back, her tears falling freely. "Goodbye, Daniel," she whispered, turning away. In her mind, she spoke the words she couldn't say aloud. "I love you," she thought, "more than you'll ever know. But love isn't enough to hold us together, not like this." She walked out, the hospital doors closing behind her, each step a wound and a release. She felt the baby move within her, a quiet strength that anchored her. "You're my future now," she thought, "and I'll build it with my own hands." Daniel lay back, the papers crumpled in his grip. "She's gone," he thought, "and I let her go." He saw her face in his mind, her strength, her grace, and his chest tightened with regret. "I should have fought harder," he mused, "but she's right. We were never free together, not really." He closed his eyes, a tear slipping free. "I'll find you again," he promised himself, "someday, somehow." But for now, he let her go, honoring the choice she'd made. Abigail stepped into the city, the air cool against her skin. She looked up at the towering buildings, a new resolve settling in her bones. "I've lost him," she thought, "but I've found myself." She walked on, her hand on her stomach, her heart heavy but whole. The love she'd felt for Daniel lingered, a soft ache she'd carry forever, but it no longer defined her. "I'm enough," she told herself, "for me, for my child," and that was her redemption. Back in the hospital, Daniel clutched the bracelet he'd fixed for her, left behind on the bedside table. "She's gone," he thought again, "but she's everywhere." He pressed it to his chest, a piece of her he could still hold. "I love you, Abigail," he whispered to the empty room, "and I always will." The silence answered him, a quiet farewell to a love that had saved them both, even as it set them free. Abigail's steps echoed on the pavement, the city stretching out before her. She didn't look back, couldn't bear to. "He gave me this," she thought, feeling the life within her, "and I'll give him the world." She smiled through her tears, a mother, a survivor, a woman reborn. The night closed around her, but for the first time she wasn't afraid. She was ready to begin again, alone but not lonely, broken but defeated. 6 months had passed since Abigail Reynolds walked away from Daniel Prescott, leaving behind the man she loved and the life she'd never truly claimed. New York City moved on, its rhythm unbroken, but Abigail carried her scars and her strength in equal measure. She stood now in the shadow of a courthouse in Manhattan, her auburn hair catching the morning light, a briefcase in one hand and a quiet resolve in her heart. She'd built something new, a law firm of her own, born from the ashes of her past. And within her, a child grew, a living echo of the love she'd let go. The streets buzzed with life as Abigail stepped out of a courtroom, victorious in yet another case. Her reputation as a divorce lawyer had soared, her name whispered with respect in legal circles. But today, as she adjusted the bracelet Daniel had once fixed for her, her thoughts drifted to him. I owe him $3 billion, she mused. A debt tied to her family's schemes, one I'll pay with my own hands. She smiled softly, touching her swollen stomach. You're my reason now, she thought, and I'll make a world worthy of you. She'd seen Daniel only once since that day in the hospital, a fleeting glimpse across a crowded street. He'd been leaving Prescott Enterprises, his dark eyes catching hers for a moment before she turned away. She hadn't stopped to speak, couldn't face the ache it would bring. I've set him free, she told herself then, and I found my own path. But the memory lingered, a bittersweet thread woven into her days. She wondered if he thought of her, if he felt the void she'd left behind. I don't regret you, Daniel, she thought now, standing before the courthouse. You gave me this gift, my child, my strength. Across the city, Daniel Prescott stood on the rooftop of his building, the skyline stretching out like a promise he couldn't keep. The divorce papers Abigail had signed lay framed on his desk, a reminder of what he'd lost. He'd rebuilt Prescott Enterprises, steadied its course after Ryan's betrayal, but the victory felt hollow. She's out there, he thought, tracing the horizon with his gaze, living a life I can't touch. He held the bracelet she'd left in the hospital, its weight a tether to her memory. She's the only woman I've ever loved, he mused, and I let her slip away. He'd heard of her success, whispers of the fearless lawyer taking Manhattan by storm. He'd seen her that day on the street, her figure unmistakable even from afar. She'd looked strong, radiant, and he'd wanted to call out to her to bridge the distance between them. But he hadn't. She chose this, he told himself, and I have to honor it. Yet as he stood there now, the wind tugging at his coat, his heart spoke a different truth. If I could go back, he thought, I'd fight for her, for us. Abigail walked to her office, a modest space filled with light and purpose. She sank into her chair, her hands resting on her stomach as the baby kicked. You're my future, she whispered, and I'll never let you down. She thought of Daniel, of the man who'd risked everything to save her, who'd loved her too late. I don't hate you, she thought. My heart still holds you even now. She smiled, a tear slipping, for she'd built this life alone, but his shadow remained, a quiet comfort she couldn't shake. Daniel stepped back inside, the city's hum fading behind him. He sat at his desk, the bracelet glinting in the soft light. I'll find her again, he thought. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. He saw her face in his mind, her strength, her grace, and his chest tightened with longing. If there's another chance, he vowed, I'll love her right the way she deserves. He closed his eyes, letting the silence wrap around him, a man changed by a love he couldn't hold. Abigail stood at her window, the city sprawling before her. She felt the baby move again, a reminder of the life she'd chosen. I'm enough, she thought, for myself, for you. She didn't need Daniel to complete her, but she carried him still, a piece of her heart forever his. Maybe one day, she mused, we'll meet again, not as strangers, not as enemies, but as something new. She turned away, her steps firm, her spirit unbroken. The city pulsed on, indifferent to their separate paths. Abigail built her empire brick by brick, a mother and a warrior. Daniel led his, a king with a quiet wound. They'd saved each other once, in a night of fate and a fight for life, and though they walked apart, their story lingered. Abigail smiled into the dawn, her child her anchor, her love her legacy. And Daniel watched the stars, her name a whisper on his lips, a hope he'd never release.